All right, guys, let's talk a little bit about the Columbian Exchange and how that fits in to the inclusion of Iberian explorers into both existing networks of trade and, in the case of the Spanish, into the linking of the Eastern and Western hemispheres and what that does to people. Now, let's just start with the real basic information. We have the old world. The old world, that's like Afro-Eurasia. And in Afro-Eurasia, you have all these different groups of people who've been living together, exposing themselves slowly over time to various microbes, diseases. They've lived through various epidemics and pandemics. We've talked about the Black Death. We haven't talked about smallpox yet, but we will be here shortly. And that exposure over time created enough genetic and microbial resistance that the old world wasn't really being burned down by disease unless the disease was something new, which is part of the reason why the Black Death was such a big problem. Now, in the New World or the Western Hemisphere, the Americas, this group of people had been isolated from a lot of the contact and exchange that had been taking place for literally 4,000 years over in Afro Eurasia. They were isolated by the Pacific and the Atlantic Oceans. And so, if there wasn't a microbial introduction before the Bering Sea land bridge was swallowed back up by the ocean, there was literally no way for people to come into contact with any of these microbes until somebody crossed the ocean and established long term contact. And Christopher Columbus and the Spanish did just that. And so, when the Columbian Exchange, which is the free movement of plants and animals and diseases, it's not a trade system, starts to begin, we see the movement of epidemic diseases. And that's really what we're going to talk about here today is how that epidemic disease spread burned down the New World. And then we'll fit all of this back into what's taking place in these trade networks. So first, let's go down and let's talk about Columbian Exchange. The Columbian Exchange primarily took food resources out of the West, right? Think about like potatoes or corn, some of the fruits and vegetables that were in the Western Hemisphere, and sent those fruits and vegetables into the Old World. So New World fruits and vegetables go out. And what's coming in? Well, what's coming in to the New World over here is going to be primarily diseases in animals, right? A lot of the large pack animals, a lot of those farming animals, cows, horses, pigs, sheep, those sorts of animals, they didn't exist in the New World anymore. And so when those animals come in, along with people, they bring in their diseases. And those diseases start to really burn through the people of the Americas. We're not being hyperbolic when we say this, that disease played a greater role in the destruction of the Amerindian or native people. That term Amerindian refers to American Indians, or shorten it up, Amerindians, burned through roughly 90% of the population over the course of about 100 years. And the reason that that occurs is because so many of these people had no genetic predisposition, no exposure. There wasn't any sort of evolution alongside the diseases because the diseases were not present, and those diseases destroyed the population. And no disease was any more impactful than smallpox, right? Smallpox, something that we're going to see is going to come out of those domesticated animals. Well, if you're a European, if you're Afro-Eurasian, you have lived amongst these domesticates for almost 10,000 years. And for 4,000 years of human civilized history, you've been living next to these animals. And over time, we see that the number of occurrences of smallpox outbreaks gets smaller in Afro-Eurasia and less deadly. More people are able to survive. However, the connection of the two different hemispheres creates a whole new population for this disease, smallpox, to burn down. And that connection would not have been made possible had it not been for the new technology that was uncovered in the Iberian Peninsula. So we're talking about ships. We're going to talk about like caravels. And we're going to talk about navigation. That's going to be like the school of navigation that trained up all of these explorers. All right. Those people are primarily going out because they're wanting to create more trade. The overall goal of these explorers, right? They're thinking, like, all right, I'm going to go out, I'm going to find all these new resources, I'm going to find all these new markets, and we're going to get more trade. Right. So these people start to increase the amount of trade taking place inside of their regions of exploration. And that increased movement, right? The increased movement that is created by this exploration connects back to economic motivations. However, there's also the unintentional spread of diseases. So that's a big issue inside of the Spanish and the Americas, this unintentional spread of diseases. That spread of diseases starts to create all these fires all over the Americas as the populations of people who live there are being killed. So the people who are living inside of the Americas are dying, which means that there's not as much labor available to do some of the different work tasks that are going to start to fit in to trade and economic motivations. Because a lot of the labor that's going to be taking place inside of the New World, this labor is going to be farm or agricultural labor, right? And so the native population does the work at first, but that native population is dying. Why are they dying? Because a lot of the smallpox, they're also receiving unfair treatment, but it's mainly the smallpox. And so the people who are doing the work, the Amerindians, die off. And now if you're a European power, you've got a problem, because if you don't have resources to export all that agricultural product, right? The food that's being exported, that is coming back over first unintentionally and then intentionally later through systems of trade. Well, if you cannot spread that food, you can't spread yourself into these trade networks, you can't make any money. So there becomes a need, right? First, Europeans are like, hey, we'll make up the difference. We'll go down. So these Europeans are like, yay, we're going to go down into the Americas and they'll do the work, right? The problem for the Europeans, though, is that the conditions are too hot. The climate, the climate being right down here on the equator, that burning hot sun, right? The sun beating down on these guys, it's really, really bad, right? The days are longer because you're next to the equator. You've got the bugs and some of the small scale diseases that aren't killing people but making them sick. Like the Europeans are no good, right? The climate is not good for Europeans. They don't like it, at least when it comes to working. So the Europeans decide, hey, you know what we should do instead? We should find somebody else who can do the work for us. So the Europeans go to Africa. Africa, much more close geographically to the climate and the conditions. And so what happens is African slaves start to be brought over from the Americas, from Africa, and transported into the Americas. And those slaves then make up the labor difference, right? And so the labor difference, that needed labor for agriculture and farms, that is going to come from Africa in the form of slaves, right? So let's talk about our bottom line for all of this and how everything connects together. We've got the Columbian exchange that occurs when the East and the West are linked together. Food resources are discovered in the Americas that turn out to be really, really profitable and good for European and Asian markets. When the Europeans come into the Americas trying to get more of that land and some of those resources and make that money, they bring with them their diseases. The diseases burn down 90% of the population. The primary offender here is smallpox, and that creates an issue inside of the global market that the Europeans are trying to dominate. The Europeans are much more involved in trade now because they have more ships, they have more navigation abilities, they have a very economic motivation to trade more. However, the more contact contact they make with Amerindians, the more labor shortage occurs because of the increase in contact that is facilitates the transfer of disease. So Europeans try to make up the difference, but they're not used to the climate, they're not used to the conditions. They can't work as hard. They go to Africa. They start buying slaves from African slavers who are more used to the conditions and are more able to thrive in the working conditions, as awful as that sounds. So, the bottom line for all of this, the Columbian Exchange inadvertently leads to slavery. That's our big takeaway from all of this right here. And once again, we see small events having really big ramifications. All right. So use this video, connect it back to some of the different resources we made available. But hopefully, this helps you better understand the Columbian Exchange and how that connects into slavery and the Spanish in the Americas. Thanks, guys.